Welcome. Thank you everybody for being here. Today is a very special and unusual day, and I'm particularly moved to greet everybody all around the world in California, in New York, Midwest, Europe, and of course people in Russia. Globus Books is a small independent bookstore in San Francisco, specializing in post-Soviet space and Russian language literature. And we are honored to host the launch of the M.F.PLATT, an anthology of feminist poetry in Russian and English today. We are about to read poetry in the world that takes an unprecedented attack on women. From Poland, where women are marching for their right to be in charge of their own bodies, to the United States, where the Handmaid's Tale is becoming reality. When I was growing up in the Soviet Union, I was taught that women are inferior, that girls can't drive, that they can't have real friendship, they can't write books. Absurd as it was, people actually believed it. And then that country was no more, and I thought that we left that insanity behind. But it turns out that I was wrong. I'm honored to introduce poets undermining this calcified world of suppression, and Globus Books is really grateful to be a platform for this milestone reading. Let me introduce to you India Anega, co-publisher of the Isolari series.
Thank you everyone for joining. We're so happy to be here. And thank you, of course, to Globus Books for bringing this together. I realize that Isolari is new to town in an extraordinary movement of poetry that's been ongoing for some time and supported for quite a long time by so many great people, all the editors of pis'mo, the poets, the translators, of course, UDP, Cicada, After Hours. We're so blown away already by the enthusiasm for this project. And the response to F-Letter so far has been immense. And I think that's, of course, because the work is so iconoclastic in Russia, as you were saying, but also I think that its poetics are global and something that has a real international life ahead of it, especially in our current political environment. And if to publish something means to create a public around it, then I think we're all participating in that right now, which is very exciting. So, we first became aware as publishers of the movement in 2016 when we read an interview between Galina and EUGENE. And at that time, our series Isolari was still a very nascent idea, but the interview really stuck with us. And I think in many ways, the work that all of the poets and pis'mo is doing helped to inspire Isolari. And we felt that, looking at movements like pis'mo and others around the world, that there were these emerging islands of thought, of literature, of art, that really constituted something like a new avant-garde, one that was global and interdisciplinary in its extent. And we really wanted to bring these islands together to create a system for orienting ourselves in the world and to narrate a journey between these places. So that's why we're releasing a new book once every 2 months as part of the Isolari series. It's by subscription. And this is, to build out this archipelago, but also to create and really sort of concretize a community around all of these different movements, these different people and their work that can travel between each new island. And so, as we were bringing the series together a couple years ago, we knew that F-Letter was one of the first books that we wanted to publish, and we're incredibly excited that it's come to fruition now. And in turn, I think a number of these books and these islands might be built upon, and that's something that F-Letter seems primed to do, to be a political campaign or a project that can be replicated elsewhere, underpin a kind of global feminist movement. And I know that that's something that Galina and that so many people who are a part of pis'mo are already thinking about. Thank you again for being here. If you haven't gotten your copy of F-Letter yet, it's available at the moment on our site, and then very soon there'll be a retail release. Globus Books will be a part of that. You can also find 2 digital forwards on our site, the first by Eileen Miles and one to come very soon by Amia Srinivasan.
Hi, the poetry in F letter. Here's the little book called F letter, New Russian Feminist Poetry. And it represents the work of some, but not all, of the members of F writing, F pis'mo, a seminar and a platform and a network for feminist and LGBT writing founded by GALINA RYMBU in 2017 in Petersburg, but now it's a network that has extended to other cities in the Russian Federation. I just want to say a couple of words about why it's not just about the Russian Federation. We've all watched the events, the demonstrations in Minsk, in the ex-Soviet space. And we all saw the role that women played in it. In fact, I found out yesterday that Olga Shparaga, the philosopher who was arrested during a demonstration, imprisoned for 15 days, and subsequently fled to Vilnius, is actually working on a book now called The Revolution Has a Woman's Face. And I think this is something that, it's a title that really very much makes sense, not only for the ex-Soviet space, but unfortunately might also be relevant to the States as of tomorrow or after tomorrow. I just want to say something that maybe is fairly obvious to everybody, but perhaps nonetheless both saying, and it's the remarkable extent to which authoritarian systems, and especially kind of recent so-called soft authoritarian systems, have based themselves in this kind of state patriarchy in a way that perhaps did not in the beginning seem entirely logical or necessary, but turns out to have a kind of inner logic. I'm going to quickly run through some of the legal aspects of this in the Russian Federation. But if you think about it, this is really the case everywhere, from Turkey, Poland, as we see now, where there's not officially one-party rule, but where there's a very dominant party that's also doing this kind of gender politics that authoritarian systems are doing. And this has to do with this attempt to harness by authoritarian systems the power inequalities, the hierarchies that are presupposed in patriarchy, and the violence that upholds them, and to use that to kind of serve the ruling elite to power. And this is something that, to me, my being a man, it looks very much like something that hurts all the participants, including the men in the system, except maybe for the members of the topmost ruling elite. And in the certain sense, it even hurts against the very men that are defending the system, even the riot police. Again, this is something that might be obvious, but nonetheless, in Russia, this use by authoritarianism of attack on gender and LGBT rights in the 2010s has been has made for quite a consistent spectacle that has such features as the 2013 parliamentary law against the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships to minors, which basically made any sort of LGBT-themed cultural anything potentially liable as criminal activity. It kind of prepared the way for such actions as the atmosphere of threat towards gay couples, and now recently there have been articles about single men also fleeing from Russia, needing to flee from Russia because they're afraid that their children would be taken away from them. The horrific anti-gay purges in Chechnya in 2017 and again in 2018. Chechnya is formally a part of Russia. On the level of gender violence, in 2017, the decriminalization of domestic violence, if it doesn't happen more than once a year and if it doesn't lead to grievous bodily harm, has led to an increase in domestic violence accompanied by a decrease in official reporting of the domestic violence. Political dissidents are regularly attacked on family values grounds. They're regularly charged with things like pornography. For example, the activist Yulia Tsvetkova, who received a pornography charge for basically posting body positive drawings on the internet. The persecution of other activists for pornography on fabricated child abuse charges, such as Yuri Dmitriev. This is unstated state policy that goes together with the banning of NGOs as foreign agents. And on the one hand, this kind of creating the picture of this heterosexual nuclear family as the support of the regime, and everything that deviates from that. And again, this is not just Russia, Turkey, similar other places. Any other sort of picture is basically kind of NATO sleepers, presented as NATO sleeper cells. And in a certain sense, I think this poetry today seems so political because in a certain sense, it's the regime that made these feelings, or at least the expression of these feelings, or the description of very simple facts as existentially political. This was my brief point. I was thinking about, what makes poetry political, and that it is not at all necessarily that it has to be some kind of anthem, that it has to be, we shall all go to the barricades. It can be something realism. Realism, weirdly enough, is political.
This is a great transition, because I was tasked with talking a little bit about our editorial process. And the way we worked, Zhenya and I worked on the anthology, was that Galia had made a big selection of poems by all of the poets represented in the book. And then I happened to be, it sounds incredible to me now because we're all stuck where we are, but I was in Germany last December and we basically sat down and started reading through the poetry. And so I like very much the point that Zhenya ended on, because the poems that Galia had selected were variously tendentious. And as we read, and we were thinking both about our own totally idiosyncratic taste, admittedly, and also about what would make it into English best, right? And this meant that we selected some poems that sort of fit the mold of straightforwardly political poetry, but we selected many poems that really did not either. And it was clear from Galia's brilliant selection that we started with that we really kind of did have the option of choosing almost anything. But I am interested when I look through the book now and I think about all of the different personalities that it was filtered through. And I think what we ended up with is something very appropriately complex, politically complex, emotionally, personally complex. Because of course, I did also want to say that this is kind of a first for both me and for Eugene. This is not material that either of us had worked with closely before. I have been stuck in the stagnation of the late Soviet period in most of my research and translation work, and Zhenya has been hanging out with the futurists and the early avant-garde. You know, in some ways that certainly affected the way we were reading this poetry, the way we were thinking about it, some of that idiosyncrasy that I point to. And in other ways, I think it just allowed us to see things in the poetry that point to the complexity and the depth that it carries, both in its immediate historical context of the moment, but I think it's gonna last.
В этой антологии довольно немного имен, и это обусловлено прежде всего форматом самого издания. И когда я выбирала тексты, потом мы вместе с вами, с переводчиками и редакторами их обсуждали, мы хотели, чтобы эти тексты показывали какие-то главные ключевые тенденции в российском феминистском письме, и чтобы по этим текстам было узнаваемо и, может быть, какие-то основные проблемы российского феминистского движения. Мне кажется, что само направление феминистского письма в России сейчас только расширяется, и вот готовится к выходу антология на русском языке, где около 50 имен. И это почти все вот новейшее поколение поэтесс.
Galia has just a few things to add. She wants to point out that, of course, the anthology actually has only a few names represented in it, and that this was mostly simply dictated by the format. As we all have been showing off our little copies, the book is small. It's still fairly fat, but it couldn't be so fat that you couldn't open it. That's from me. And she says that when she was choosing the original texts, her main aim was to just demonstrate these main trends of Russian feminist writing, the key moments of today's feminist writing, and also writing that addressed some of what she saw as the primary problems faced by women writing in Russia today and women in general. And she also would like to point out that the movement of feminist writing in Russia is only getting bigger. And right now, a much bigger Russian language anthology with over 50 poets represented in it is getting ready to be printed. And that this represents even younger poets, a new generation of people who are writing.
И в заключение скажу, что то, что вы видите в этой антологии, это только некоторый слой, срез того большого поля феминистской поэзии, которая сейчас развивается в России. Срез прекрасный и довольно радикальный, но также и глубоко связанный с разными традициями и направлениями русскоязычного письма, начиная от начала 20 века и заканчивая сегодняшним.
Galina says that what the anthology gives us is a kind of a cross-section, a small cross-section, but nevertheless a wonderfully representative one of Russian feminist writing today. And she points out that as a cross-section, it is fairly radical, but at the same time, it represents ties to traditions of Russian poetry reaching back to the beginning of the 20th century. And that's actually something, I'll say as co-host, that's actually something we hope to talk more about with the poets after we read. My name is AINSLEY MORSE. I'm a co-editor of this anthology. I'm a translator, and I also teach Russian language and literature. LOLITA AGAMALOVA, born in 1997 in Grozny, Chechnya, currently lives in Moscow. A radical anarcho-feminist and lesbian activist, Agamalova is currently a doctoral student in philosophy. Her poems combine post-structuralist terminological networks, concepts from feminist theory, and determinedly transgressive and symbolic images. So the poem which we are going to read, Dilige e quod vis fac, which translingually rethinks love and do whatever you want, St. Augustine's instruction from the Easter sermons of 307 AD.
Dilige et quod vis fac. В саду фаллических регалий, в саду аддикций, ты знаешь, где главный цветок распускается охуевшими письменами. И я пишу тебе письма, скрываясь в густых садах. Я люблю твои медные кости, я люблю твой пупок, распускающийся сухими корнями переплетенных сваток в подобии органической, преддискурсивной и однополой ебли. Я люблю твои родинки, складывающиеся в язык, разрезающие язык в сумерках позабытого языка, в шрифт лесбиянки и зуботычинку Брайлев. Я люблю твои волоски, напоминающие о перспективной ебле в семантической ржи и здоровых жуков под зубами, под простынями, в корнях золотых корней, золотых вещей. Все в этом мире напоминает мне еблю. Эн просыпается, смотрится в потолок. И все в этом мире Эн напоминает еблю. Иногда она выходит в мир чистого знания, чистого вещества, но чаще даже чтение Платина, Порфирия или Прокла говорит ей о ебле. Все в этом мире напоминает мне еблю. Я смотрю в потолок, просыпаюсь в чаду, и мы — аддиктивно переплетающиеся растения, сердце готового слова из порнохабов, в этой маленькой полумещанской жизни, не спрятанной за протекающей антологией всех открытых ФФ, закрытых литератур, вблизи крыси фантазмов, разгрызающих горячеющие животы молодым побегом, и все в этом мире напоминает мне еблю. Когда твой оргазмический крик казался тем самым криком, разрезающим ночь дискурсивности, где крысы фантазмы жрут самое себя и воспроизводят себя под крики и медленные критики распыляющегося насилия. Пускай разворот той ночи давно обветрен, в ошметках крови, засохшей смазки, и губы твои синие то ли от холода, то ли вина. И мою пизду изнутри как будто изъела плесень, что было бы если. И на улице бы не предлагали сперму вместо воды, когда от бедности пересыхает горло, и ты тактично отказываешься и вспоминаешь в святостях, как в шелках фантазматического огня, соляная ведьма на огне русских радиоволн, мастурбация, лишенная всех языков, которыми овладела. Как мы бьемся черными треугольниками, обожженными языками, как я тебе отлизываю, превращаюсь в большой язык, в новый большой язык, расплавляющий горькую лаву, как сад аддикций немеет и расступается выжженными землями, сдобренными кровью и спермой, и я, расступаясь, схватывается, как я, мессианской лебединальной горечью, размокая, чмокая, чавкая, хлюпая за языками, in a deep dike, тесные и расправляемые прозрачными костылями, и я выдыхаю хик, говорю руками, как отец церкви. Все, что когда-либо было сказано истинного, то наше. Остальное режь, побивай камнями, как тогда сараю. Dilige et quod vis fac, любимая, дорогая.
I'll read the English translation, which was done by Eugene OSTASHEVSKY and me. In the garden of phallic regalia, garden of addictions, you know, where the head bloom blooms with overweening letters. As I write you letters, hiding out in the thick gardens, I love your bronze bones. I love your navel blooming with dry roots facing off, intertwined in the likeness of organic, prediscursive, and single-sex fucking. I love your moles furling into a tongue, slitting the tongue in the twilight of the forgotten tongue into lesbian type and the toothy punch of braille. I love your pubes suggesting perspective fucking in the semantic rye, and massive beetles under teeth sheets rooting in gold roots for gold things. Everything in this world makes me think of fucking. N wakes up, gazes at the ceiling, and everything in this world makes N think of fucking. Sometimes she goes out in the world of pure knowledge, pure substance, but more often, even the reading of Plotinus, Porphyry, or Proclus makes her think of fucking. Everything in this world makes me think of fucking. I look up at the ceiling, awakening, addled, and we, plants intertwining addictively in the heart of a lexical ready-made from the porn hubs in this small half-bourgeois life, not hidden behind the leaky ontology of all open fan fictions, closed-off literatures, close to rat phantasms, gnawing open the febrile bellies of juvenile sprigs. Everything in this world makes me think of fucking. When your orgasmic cry seemed to be that very cry, slitting open the night of discursivity, where rat phantasms devour themselves and reproduce to the cries and creeping critiques of atomizing violence. It's fine that the spread of that night is wind-chapped. A long time now in blood clods, dried lube, your lips blue either from cold or wine. My cunt like eaten away on the inside by mold. What would it be like if out on the street they didn't tender you sperm instead of water when your throat seizes with poverty? And you refuse tactfully and remember, as in silky sainthoods of phantasmic fire, a salt witch in the bonfire of Russian radio waves, divested by masturbation of all the tongues she ever mastered. As we do battle with black triangles and scorched tongues, as I lick you out, transubstantiating into a great tongue, a new great tongue of the liquefaction of bitter lava, as the garden of addictions falls silent, then comes apart, like scorched earths before the fertilizer of sperm, blood, as I coming apart is seized in the liquefaction of messianic libidinal gall, smacking, slurping, squelching beyond the beyond tongues, in a deep dike, in narrows and straights, spread out by translucent crutches, breathe out, hic. I speak with hands like a church father. Everything that has ever been spoken in truth, this is ours. Slit the throats of the rest, stone it with stones, give it Soraya's sorrow, dilige e quod visfats, my love, my dear.
I'm Eugene OSTASHEVSKY or Zhenya OSTASHEVSKY. I'm gonna read with Yulia Podlubnova. Before I read, I want to say that the interview that India referred to was actually not by me, but by Joan Brooks. But it was a terrific interview with Ghana. Anyway, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Yulia Podlubnova, who is currently living in Moscow, but teaching remotely in Ekaterinburg, where she is living normally. She's a lecturer at Ural State University in literature and textual editing, a literary critic of contemporary poetry, and with another one of the poets here, with Ekaterina Simonova and with Natalia Stanikova. She's the co-editor of InVersia, which is a poetry series and imprint of a publishing house in Ekaterinburg called Кабинетный ученый, which publishes both scholarly books and literature. She is the author of a book of poetry, a book of criticism of contemporary Russian poetry from the Urals, several anthologies, and a book of interviews of the prominent Russian poet Ольга Дяккарова.
Пустой магазин. Ген генерала, пыль патриарха, пол полицейских, бесконечная улыбка надзирателя, комитет ежедневного непроизвольного волеизъявления, машины света и добра утилизируют тебя. Попытки описать бессодержательность гильз, содержимое человека, или, к примеру, праздничные витрины в годовщину Кровавого воскресенья, Голубые глаза продавщицы фарша.
The Empty Store, General Jean, Patriarch Powder, Gendarme Gender, the Warden, his unbounded grin, Committee for the Quotidian, Unintentional Declaration of Intent, Machinery of Goodness and Light instrumentalizes you. Attempts to describe the contentlessness of casings, human contents, or say holiday window displays for the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the blue eyes of the ground meat saleswoman. I just want to say that what drew me to these poems in the first place is just the sheer exuberance of the word plays. Basically, every word combination is some kind of complicated single, often double, often triple pun, which makes it very difficult to translate. So, of course, that was what I wanted to translate.
Приходят на ум разные вещи. Набережная, фонтанки, береженая, любимая, милая, пришивай треугольник к розовым худи. Тонкие деревья разума не выдерживают, гнутся. А потом Стрельня, Выбор, Гневский проспект, тень свастик метро, острогубых хлабрисов, мартанутых смартфонов, государственных символов правопорядка. В Питере гнить, как сказал бы романтик, батискаф погружается. Девочка, 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 девочка.
Different things come true, Mindy. Fontanka, tank, embankment, bank, safe, guardedly live girl, sew triangles in pink to pink hoodies, thin trees of reason, bear not the burden and bend. After that, take you to Fucky Town, shooting galleries, the prospect of never. Shadows of metro swastikas, sharp-lipped labris, more than smartphones, state symbols of claw and ordure. Petersburg is for petering out, a romantic would say. The bathysphere where the potentate plunges boldly. Girly, 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 girly.
Поколение кока-кола-едов против поколения телевизионеров. Клацающие клавиатуры против женщин с проводами химзавивки. Томики стихов мировой тоски, блоки, блоки, системные блоки. Заживо православные зиги, как попытки удержаться за воздух. Я смотрю в пустое небо с самолетами. Родина, фамилия моей начальницы.
Generations of Coca-Colans versus generation of televisionaries, clacking keyboards, women with wiry perms, volumes of poetry full of world weariness, blocks, super blocks, mainframes away, orthodox alive, Zeke Hiles grasping at air. I look at empty skies full of planes. My boss, her name is Motherland.
I'm Helena. I translate from Russian to English with primary focus on contemporary poetry. And really happy to be reading today with YULIA DJABBAROVA, who was born in Ekaterinburg and still lives there today. She graduated from the Ural University and teaches Russian as a foreign language. Her poetry has been published in numerous magazines in Russia, and her third book, Krasnaya knopka trivоги, the red button of anxiety, has just been published by Paradigma. And from the book, we have a little description of her poetry, which says that it focuses on the exploitation and violence against women and LGBTQ+ people in Muslim cultures of the ex-Soviet space. And the poem that we're going to read today has a title which is the slogan of the campaign in support of the Khachaturian sisters who are currently on trial in Russia. And it incorporates the Azeri for rest in peace and the Turkish for take it easy in this refrain that recurs.
Я, мы, сестры Хачатурян. Маленькие запуганные девочки нам говорят: познакомься, от тебя не убудет, надень платье, сиди ровно, веди себя скромно, производи впечатление женщины благопристойной. Правило 388. Ты зеркало своих предков, главный позор народа, умирающий язык сидящих на застолье. Там на пляже, где женщины всегда одеты, а мужчины неприлично обнажены, стенают огромные черные волны, просятся из груди небесного Бога. Аллах рахматиласин, колай герсин, не бейте. Мехди зарабатывает 50 манатов за час, задыхается от астмы в душном авто, 20 дней за проституцию в СИЗО, 4 койки на 17 человек, постоянные побои и насильственные телодвижения. Отец твой грех твой, Мехди, ты грех отца твоего, гниющие плоды Эдемского сада, не надо, хватит, перестаньте, не бейте. Малика торжествует, танцует и собирает купюры, 10-й бокал вина залпом, как и подобает на фиктивной свадьбе. Последняя шлюпка в гигантском океане, зияющая дыра видна в груди ее и слышится из глубины. Аллах рахматласин, колагельсин, и стенание не бейте. В детстве самое страшное милиционер. В грязной обуви ходит по залу, выпирающее жало из-за спины, повсюду кровавое месиво, топор, перевернутый кухонный стол, женщина, обнимающая собственные колени, бесконечно повторяет: «Не бейте! Боль твою унесу с собой, горечь, печаль, соль морскую с плеч, невозможно смыть до конца, баха, раны тянутся вдоль земного пути утрат, 3 ребра, ключица, палец ноги, хрупкие, обретенные вновь, не бейте, ради Бога, там, где всегда вода, холодная, мутная, как раки, сердце осталось, а другое погребено, под руками мужчины, пьющего как черт, под разделочной, поделенной надвое доской, под звуком сломанных костей. Аллах рахматиласин, колайгарсин, и стенание не бейте. Подойти и обнять каждого попеременно. Бабушку, мать, сестру, подругу, неизвестную, коллегу, беспризорную, маленькую девочку, женщину, как хрупкое сокровище, как аккуратные листочки сапфира, на ветру вытягивающиеся к солнцу, как тонкие линии веревок с бельем поверх слегка мокрого асфальта, смыть все шрамы, раны, царапины, ожоги, ножевые, пулевые отверстия, повторять: не бейте никого из нас, никогда, во веки веков. Аминь.
We are all the Hachatourian sisters. Terrified little girls, they tell us, say hello, it won't hurt you, put on a dress, sit up straight, behave modestly, act like a lady. Rule number 388. You are the mirror of your ancestors, the greatest shame of your people, the dying tongue of those at the feast. There on the beach where women are always clothed and men are exposed, indecent, the enormous black waves wail. A cry rips from the chest of a heavenly God. Allah rahmet alasin, golai gelsin, don't hurt me. Mehdi earns 50 manats an hour, gasps from asthma in a stifling car. 20 days awaiting trial for prostitution, 4 beds between 17, beatings without end and violent movements. Your father, your sin, Mehdi, you are your father's sin. The rotting fruit of the Garden of Eden. Don't, stop it, no, please don't hurt me. Malika rejoices, dances, gathers banknotes, gulps down her 10th glass of wine. It's only proper for a sham wedding. The last lifeboat in the immense ocean. A hole gapes in her chest, and from the depths you can hear Allah rahmet alasin, kolai gelsin, and wailing, don't hurt me. For kids, the most terrifying thing is a police sergeant who paces the room in filthy shoes, a wasp stinger jutting from his back. A bloody mess everywhere, an axe, a kitchen table overturned. A woman clasping her own knees repeats without end, don't hurt me. I'll take away your pain, your sorrow, bitter grief. You can't wash away the sea salt from your shoulders, Bachar. Wounds stretch along an earthly path of loss. 3 ribs, a collarbone, a toe. Fragile, discovered anew. Please, God, don't hurt me. I'm begging you. The place where there's always water, cold, cloudy, like Raki. 1 heart was left and another buried beneath the hands of a man who drank like the devil. Beneath the butcher's block chopped in 2. Beneath the sound of broken bones. Allah rahmet alasin, kolay gelsin and wailing, don't hurt me. Come here and greet them all in turn. Grandmother, mother, sister, friend, stranger, colleague, waif, girl, woman, like a fragile treasure, like delicate leaves of Caucasian boxwood, reaching for the sun in the breeze, like fine lines of cord hung with clothes above the slightly dampened tarmac. Wash away the gashes, the slashes, the scratches, the burns, the holes from knives and guns, repeat. Don't hurt any of us ever again, for all eternity. Amen.
So I'm Kit Eganton. I'm one of the editors of Hypocrite Reader and a fairly new translator. Being on this book was a huge honor for me. I'll say a couple words about Ekaterina. She was born in 1977 in Nizhny Tagil, but she lives now in Ekaterinburg. Simonova is one of the editors of the poetry series InVersia, which is one of the few Russian publishing projects operated only by women. She moved from traditional to freer verse poetic forms to treat female subjectivity in the daily life of provincial towns with greater realism. And she's also a librarian and posts very cool library books that she finds on Facebook.
Каждый раз, когда умирает моя очередная неоплодотворенная яйцеклетка, когда не становится на одного человека больше, остается жить еще один амурский тигр, таймень обыкновенный, кабарга, беломордый дельфин, манул, морж атлантический, красная книга становится живой и зеленой. Снится мне, обнимает меня пушистыми лапками, мокрыми плавниками, трутся ласково, а мое лицо мордами и боками благодарят за мою заботу. Снится мне, больше нас нет, вылетает на свет, птица-тупик, кроншнепы, степной лунь, плещет крылами. Радуется хоботковая собачка Петерса, северный длинношерстный вомбат, морской ангел. Мир наступил от края до края. Прибрежные воды становятся чище, города зарастают травой. Бетон и металл приходят в негодность. Атомные электростанции, нефтяные вышки, бочки с химическими отходами. Имя всему покой. Облако встревоженных бабочек поднимается на фоне ядовитого облака.
Ekaterina Simonova, in translation by Kit Eganton. Every time, with the death of another of my unfertilized eggs, when one less additional human life is made, another Siberian tiger gets to live, another taimen, another musk deer, a white-beaked dolphin, a manul, or an Atlantic walrus. The red book becomes alive and green. I have this dream. They're hugging me with their fuzzy paws and wet flippers, rubbing my face with their snouts and flanks, thanking me for taking care. I have this dream. There's no more us. Flying out into the light come the puffin, the curlew, the pale harrier, wings beating, the black and rufous elephant shrew, the hairy-nosed wombat, the angel shark. Peace has spread far and wide. Coastal waters are becoming cleaner. The cities are overgrown with grass. Concrete and metal are falling into disrepair, like nuclear power plants and oil derricks, barrels of chemical waste. Everything bears the name of peace. A cloud of startled butterflies rises on the backdrop of a toxic cloud. I should say that in the notes section, we point out that the red book, there's a reference to the red book in this poem, which is a list of endangered species, the name for the list of endangered species in Russia.
Осталось уже совсем немного. Еще 20 лет, и никто не подумает, что у меня может быть секс. Еще 30 лет, и никто не подумает, что у меня когда-то мог быть секс. Вот, стоит позади меня в троллейбусе, просит передать на билет за двоих. Разве кто-то может перебирать эти поредевшие волосы? Разве может к кому-то прижиматься это дряблое тело? Разве могли и могут ее хотеть мужчины и женщины? Уже 30 лет это то, что не нужно знать никому, потому что этого просто не должно быть. Вот выходят они, уходят в солнечном утреннем свете, поддерживая одна другую. Отвисшая кожа повыше локтя, сутулые спины, нелепых два верблюжонка, не касаясь друг друга больше, чем следует. Жизнь так сложилась, что у них нет никого, кроме друг друга. Им просто не повезло встретить того самого. Перед сном одна пролистывает Инстаграм, наполовину состоящий из мертвых. Вторая мажет кремом руки в коричневых пятнах, после жалуясь на боли в спине, в шее, на то, как у нее в последнее время сводит во сне ноги, забирает первый телефон, кладет голову ей на плечо, просовывает руку под пижаму. Главное, никому об этом не говорить. Уже 30 лет это то, что не нужно знать никому, потому что этого просто не должно быть.
Again, translated by Kit Eganton. There's not much time left. In 20 years, no one will imagine I might have sex. In 30 more, no one will think I could ever have had sex. Look, standing behind me on the trolley, asking me to pass along fare for 2 tickets. Could anyone ever run fingers through that straggly hair? Could that sagging body press up against another? Could men and women want her now or ever? For 30 years now, it's been something no one must know, because these things just aren't supposed to happen. Look, they're getting out, walking away in the morning light, one supporting the other. Loose skin above the elbow, stooped backs, 2 ridiculous camel colts, not touching each other more than they ought. Life worked out this way. They only have each other. Neither ever managed to meet the right guy. Before bed, one of them flicks through Instagram. Half of the people she follows are dead. The second one dabs cream on her hands covered in liver spots, then complaining about the pain in her back and neck, about how lately she gets cramp in her legs at night, takes the phone from the other woman, lays her head on her right shoulder, slips her hand underneath her pajamas. The main thing is not to tell anyone about this. For 30 years now, it's been something no one must know, because these things just aren't supposed to happen. Valgina Mort will read from her translation of the poem Summer, Gates of the Body, and Kevin Platt will read from his translation of My Vagina.
I'm very happy to be joining you today. So I'm a poet from Minsk, Belarus, currently the coolest place on earth, but I'm tuning in from Ithaca, New York, the remotest place on earth. And I translated Gali's poem, Summer, Gates of the Body, the day when I read it, and I think that I read it the day when it was published. Sometimes the translation is a conversation, sometimes the translation is a confrontation. And for me, it was neither in this case, but translating this poem was akin to just nodding my head in agreement. It was a way of saying, I agree with you, Galina, me too. Galina was born in 1990 in the Siberian city of Omsk, and she lives currently in Lviv, Ukraine. She's a poet, activist, and founding co-editor of pis'mo. And AINSLEY and EUGENE already spoke about this wonderful and important platform for feminist and queer writing. Galina is also a co-founder of the Arkady Dragomoshenko Prize for Emerging Russian Language Poets. She has published 3 books of poems in Russia, and her work has been translated into a dozen of languages. English translations of her poems appeared in journals like White Review, Arc Poetry, Music and Literature, N+1, Asymptote, and others. And what's particularly exciting is that a full collection of her poetry has been translated by Joan Brooks, and it's called Life in Space, and it has already been released by Ugly Duckling Presse. The poem that we're going to read together, first Galina in Russian, and then I will read it in English, consists in 14 parts. But we are going to be merciful. Just one time, we will read only one part. For you, we will read part 11, часть 11. I picked this part because I thought it would resonate to a lot of women stuck at home during COVID, and the kind of issues that arise from that.
Иногда мне кажется, что мои руки — это маленькие быстрые лапки. Стирают, моют, готовят, перекладывают вещи с места на место. Но им, вещам, никогда места нет. Мы живем слишком тесно. Дом переполнен вещами, как гнездо запасливых птиц. А когда мы устали, кричим и клюем друг друга. Вот наш сын выпал из гнезда в новую игру, сложный мир. Лапки живут свою жизнь. Они пишут по ночам, в туалете, в трамвае, в гостинице, посреди улицы, даже в постели. Лапки, быстрее, нужно успеть. А голова, как у большой тревожной птицы, вертится туда-сюда. Думает, что сделать, как сделать. Он голоден, я голодна, они голодны, почти весь мир уже голоден, где-то и воды нет. Надо придумать еду и воду, чтобы шла ко всем отовсюду. Лапка, пиши. Лапки, наверное, как у енота, быстрые, суетливые. Но если когда-то появится тот, кто сделает что-то, что делал отец, что делали мальчики в школе, парни с района, мужчины вообще незнакомые, пьяные друзья и поэты, я знаю, у меня есть когти, острые вообще как бритвы. Они разорвут его тело, выпустят его кровь на свободу, даже если будут бояться. Лапки. Помню руки бабушки, твердые как камни, все в трещинах от стирки и мыла, как сухая степная глина, а в трещинах розовая мякоть, капельки крови. Она сидит у печки на табуретке и гладит, успокаивает свои руки. Еще немного, и можно уснуть. Мама говорит, бабе нужен хороший крем для рук. Нет, ей нужен какой-то другой мир, где дед не бежит за ней с собачьей цепью по огороду, где еда и вещи создаются сами, мир другого труда. Погладь меня камнями, баба, полежи рядом со мной, как я лежу сейчас рядом с сыном, и тогда мои руки — это просто мои руки. И рошат волосы на его голове, двигают время в любые стороны, в любом порядке, как магниты на холодильнике. В одной из сторон, когда все гнезда бумажных торшеров нашей панельки вспыхивают одновременно, и кастрюли на кухне гудят, танцует мокрое белье, множится хлеб. Мама, я снова хочу съесть твою шершавую руку, которая гладит меня.
Sometimes it seems that my hands are swift, tiny paws. They launder, wash, cook, move things from place to place. But there's no place for the things we live tightly. The house is filled with things like a nest of thrifty birds. But when we get tired, we shriek and peck each other. Here our son fell out from the nest into a new game, into a complicated world. Paws live their own life. They write at night on the toilet, in the tram, in the hotel, in the middle of a street, even in bed. Rush, paws, so much to do. And my head is like the head of a large, restless bird moving left to right, thinking of what to do and how to do it. He's hungry, I'm hungry, they're hungry. Almost the whole world is hungry. Somewhere there isn't even water. We have to invent food and water that would reach everyone from everywhere. Right, Paw. Paws perhaps like raccoons, swift, fidgety. Yet if someone comes and does what father did, what boys did at school and guys from the neighborhood, total strangers, drunk friends and poets, I know I have claws, I'd say razor sharp. They would tear his body, release his blood, even if they're scared, little paws. I remember grandmother's hands, hard like stones, cracked from laundry and soap, like dried steppe clay, also cracked, and pink pulp in the cracks, droplets of blood. She sits on a low stool by the stove and caresses, comforts her own hands. Just a bit longer, and then I can sleep. Mama says, Grandma needs a good hand cream. No, she needs a different world where grandfather doesn't chase her with a dog's chain across the garden, where food and things create themselves, a world of different labor. Caress me with stones, Grandma, lie next to me. The way I lie right now next to my son, and my hands are only my hands, rumpling his hair, moving time in any directions, in any order, like magnets on the refrigerator. In one direction, when all the nests of paper lampshades in our apartment block light up simultaneously, and the pots in the kitchen are whistling, wet laundry dances, bread multiplies. Mama, once again, I want to eat your rough hand that caresses me.
I teach in Philadelphia and I translate Russian poetry, a number of different poets. And I just wanted to say I had translated Galina before in the context of a poetry translation festival that we hold here in Philadelphia periodically. And I was really struck by what Balzina said, that she, translated Summer in one gulp right after she saw it. Something similar happened with this poem that was written for special reading in connection with the prosecution of Yulia Tsvetkova, who is a activist from Komsomolsk na Amur, who is being prosecuted under the the so-called gay propaganda law in Russia for body positive images of vaginas that she posted on a site that she runs. Galina read this poem, I can't remember the exact date, and then published it on her Facebook page. And I saw it and I asked her if I could translate, and she said yes. And I think I had a first draft of it up on my page within a day or two of its first reading. It's just a super powerful poem. I think you see a lot of Galina's trademark capabilities as a poet. It's this incredible combination of the physical and the metaphysical all in one bunch. We're only reading half of it because it's a rather long text, but you'll have to buy the book and read the rest of it yourselves.
17 мая 2013 года под музыку группы «Смысловые галлюцинации» из моей вагины вышел сын. А затем плацента, которую акушерка держала как мясник, взвешивая на ладони. Доктор положил мне сына на грудь. Тогда еще не знала имени сына. И сказал: «Ваш сын». И сын тут же описал мне грудь и живот. А мир стал моей вагиной, сыном, его горячей струйкой, его мокрой теплой головой, моим пустым животом. Потом мою вагину зашили. Она изменила форму, стала узкой и стянутой, вагина-тюрьма, вагина-рана. На мне тогда были белые компрессионные чулки, все в крови, дешевое красное платье-халат, купленное в китайском павильоне, а на нем две женщины, держащие кроны деревьев, и звери, держащие женщин. Без трусов, без поддержки, с запутанными волосами, Я шла после операции по солнечному коридору роддома забирать сына. Я взяла его и подумала. Его пальцы похожи на маленьких мармеладных червячков. Теперь моя вагина — это норка для твоего коричневого зверька с большой красной головкой, куда он иногда проскальзывает, чтобы набраться сил. Это ямка для твоего нежного языка, для твоих тонких крепких пальцев, похожих на письменные принадлежности из прошлого века. Моя вагина сжимается сейчас, рядом с ней, чуть выше набухает клитор. Он похож на бусинку и завернут в нежный складчатый капюшончик, который иногда можно снять под слепым дождем легких прикосновений. Ты можешь, аккуратно. Когда мне было 13, я пыталась засунуть туда дачный огурец. Хотела понять, что такое секс. Тогда я еще не знала, что это не только пенетрация. Я часто смотрела на свой клитор в маленькое разбитое зеркальце, которое папа использовал для бритья. Я была сухим деревом, которое горело с каждым днем все сильнее. Я жила в мире школьной литературы, где все видно только мужским взглядом, в мире районных разборок и падиков, набитых потными парнями в черных куртках и рваных ботинках. Я любила сидеть на картах, любила обтягивающие джинсы, сдавливающие клитор и большие губы. Тогда я еще не знала, что до моей вагины всем есть дело: государству, родителям, гинекологам, незнакомым мужчинам, православным батюшкам, у которых под рясой погоны, а на рясе женская кровь, работодателям, эшникам, военным, нацикам, миграционным службам, банкам, консервативным критикам развратного образа жизни, патриотичным деятелям культуры, юзающим традиционные ценности под коньячок. Из моей вагины раз в месяц идет кровь, и тогда мой любимый идет в магазин за прокладками. Мне нравятся тонкие, с запахом ромашки. Иногда кровь вываливается сгустками, похожими на круглые шлемы маленьких астронавтов. Мой менструальный космос в миниатюре, планета матки, кометы яичников, млечная галактика, припухшие вульвы. Иногда кровь льется, как водка, из специального узкого горлышка сувенирной бутылки. Иногда ее нет. Мне нравится заниматься сексом во время месячных. Все тело становится суперчувствительным. Люблю, когда твой член весь в моей крови. И люблю представлять, что у тебя тоже месячные, что соленая теплая кровь капает из маленькой дырочки на твоей головке. Люблю, когда твои руки липкие от моей крови, когда она засыхает на твоих ногтях и заусенцах. Люблю чувствовать, как пульсирует матка в моем животе, словно второе сердце, как набухает грудь и становится горячей, как будто оттуда вот-вот польется молоко. Я дам тебе его пить, любимый, оно зальет твое лицо, твои нежные розовые соски, почти как у девочки. Сделает мокрыми твои волоски на груди, твою шею, животик, в котором я мечтаю, ты когда-нибудь сможешь выносить нашу дочь. Люблю, когда ты говоришь о моей вагине, и когда мы вместе ее обсуждаем, пока ты сидишь на мне сверху, в моей футболке и зеленых сережках, которые я тебе подарила. Люблю, когда ты легонько шлепаешь меня по губам. Как хорошо, что ты делаешь это не в России, где Юлю Цветкову хотят отправить в тюрьму за нежные рисунки вагины, где мои подруги боятся целоваться на улице, где мы с Катей после школы подолгу лежали на ковре у нее дома и трогали друг друга, превращались в одно соленое море, а потом боялись об этом говорить. Наши вагины и вульвы называют кисками, но у меня скорее не киска, а домашняя декоративная мышка, маленькая, пушистая, беспокойная. Она умрет раньше времени. Она умрет в клетке.
My Vagina. On May 17th, 2013, to music by Semantic Hallucinations, a son came out of my vagina. And then the placenta, which the midwife held like a butcher, weighing it in her hands. The doctor placed my son at my breast. At this point, I still didn't know his name, and said, "Your son." And immediately my son peed all over my breasts and stomach, and the world became my vagina, my son, his burning stream, his wet, warm head, my empty belly. Then they stitched up my vagina. It changed shape, became narrow and constricted, a vagina prison, vagina wound. I was wearing white compression stockings, all bloody, a cheap red wrap dress bought at the Chinese market, and on it 2 women holding the crowns of trees and beasts holding the women. With no underwear, no support, with tangled hair, post-op, I walked along the maternity hospital's sunny hallway to collect my son. I picked him up and thought, his fingers look like little gummy worms. Now my vagina is a burrow for your little brown beast with its big red head, where he slips in once in a while to gather strength. It's a furrow for your tender tongue, for your thin, strong fingers, resembling last century's writing instruments. Now my vagina is contracting, and next to it, a little higher, my clitoris is swelling. It looks like a little bead, and it's wrapped in a delicate folded hood, which sometimes can be pulled back under a blind rain of light touches. Go ahead, careful. When I was 13, I tried to push a summer cucumber into it. I wanted to understand what sex was. I didn't know back then that it's not just penetration. I often looked at my clitoris with the little broken mirror that Papa used for shaving. I was dry wood that burned stronger every day. I lived in a world of assigned reading, where everything is viewed with the male gaze. In the world of gang fights and stairwells crammed with sweaty guys in black jackets and tattered boots, I loved squatting on my haunches, loved tight jeans pressing against my clitoris and big lips. I didn't know then that everyone had an interest in my vagina. The state, my parents, gynecologists, strange men, Orthodox priests with epaulets under their robes and women's blood on their robes, employers, anti-extremism agents, the military, fascists, immigration cops, banks, conservative critics of depraved lifestyles, patriotic cultural figures, appropriators of traditional values washed down with brandy. Blood comes from my vagina once a month, and then my beloved gets to go to the store for pads. I like the thin ones with chamomile scent. Sometimes the blood spills out in clots that look like the round helmets of little astronauts. My menstrual cosmos in miniature, the womb planet, egg comet, swollen vulva as milky galaxy. Sometimes the blood pours like vodka from the special narrow neck of a souvenir bottle. Sometimes there's no blood. I love to have sex during my period. My whole body gets super sensitive. I love it when your penis is covered with my blood, and love to imagine that you're also on your period, that salty warm blood is dripping from the little hole in your glands. I love it when your hands are sticky with my blood, when it dries on your nails and ragged cuticles. Love to feel my womb pulsing in my belly like a second heart, my breasts swelling and getting warm, like milk is about to pour out of them. I'll let you drink it, love. It will pour over your face, your tender pink nipples, almost like a girl's, wetting the fuzz on your chest, neck, your tummy, where in my dreams, you might someday carry our daughter. I love when you talk about my vagina and when we discuss it together while you sit on top of me in my t-shirt and the green earrings that I gave you. Love it when you lightly slap against my lips. It's so good you're not doing it in Russia, where they want to send Yulia Tsvetkova to prison for delicate images of vaginas, where my girlfriends are afraid to kiss in the street, where Katya and I would lie forever on the rug after school over at her place, touching one another, turning into a single salty sea, and then we're scared to talk about it. They call our vaginas and vulvas pussies, but mine is less like a pussy than a fancy pet mouse. Small, furry, and restless. Will it die before its time? Will it die in a cage?
Question about literary genealogy. We are aware from it's one of the foci in Galina's preface to the book is the unprecedented nature of some of this movement, some of the themes that are discussed and used in these poems in relation to the Russian poetry that came before. It's true that there hasn't been a movement this widespread of poetry that identifies itself as explicitly feminist in the Russian poetic tradition. There certainly have been women poets and feminist poets, but nothing like this kind of level of organization. So we were wondering about how those of you in the anthology, how you feel about your poetic genealogy. What kind of important predecessors would you point to? Men, women, anyone?
So we also had a parallel question about poetic form, whether you develop the forms that you're working in thinking of predecessors, whether directly or polemically.
Наверное, когда я начинала писать тексты, которые можно назвать феминистскими, я не могла провести какую-то четкую генеалогию с предшествующими текстами в русской поэзии, где темы телесности, сексуальности и радикальной критики, в общем, режимов сексуальности использовались бы.
So when I first started writing texts that I thought were feminist, I couldn't really establish a genealogy for myself that had the themes of corporeality, of gender. So I didn't entirely know who my predecessors were.
Косвенно, наверное, на мое ощущение поэтической свободы, свободы, с какой могут выражаться состояния, связанные с телесностью, с переживаниями, может быть, даже с какой-то трансгрессией, повлияла Елена Шварц. Это петербургская поэтка последней трети XX века. Она не была феминисткой, но очень важна для меня. Я вот сейчас расскажу, чем.
But indirectly, in the feeling of poetic freedom, in the approach towards the body, towards affect, the person that was very influential for me was Elena Schwartz, who was a poetess of mostly the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, but who did not identify as a feminist.
Елена Шварц не боялась соединения простого и возвышенного в поэзии. И она не боялась соединения каких-то экстатических состояний, близких даже к религиозному аффекту, и состояний, связанных, собственно, с женской телесностью. Так она описывала, например, в некоторых текстах свое похмелье.
Elena Schwartz was not afraid of combining the simple, the everyday with complex. She was not afraid of talking about ecstatic, almost religious states. And she also was able to talk about her body, even such ungainly things as her body in Hangover.
Она, например, могла писать о каких-то чуть ли не религиозных видениях и писать, собственно, визионерские тексты, но всегда подчеркивая контекст, в котором к ней приходят эти видения, например, просто стоя на кухне, не знаю, в халате, так я это представляла.
So she could write very lofty things like religious visions, and at the same time talk about kind of the everyday banal context in which these visions would come to her, you know, standing in the kitchen in a bathrobe.
Говорят, что она обладала очень буйным нравом и вообще была хулиганкой и не боялась вступать в полемику с поэтами-мужчинами и даже могла разбить кому-то об голову графин вина на литературном вечере.
Mm-hmm. So they say she was quite unruly, perhaps even aggressive, was not afraid of getting into arguments with male poets, and has even said to have broken a carafe of wine over a male poet's head at a poetry reading, which is why we all go to poetry readings.
Одновременно она писала очень свободные полиритмические тексты и, например, обладала очень консервативными взглядами на поэзию, считая, что европейская поэзия разлагает всю поэтическую природу и приводит в упадок.
At the same time as she wrote these very free polyrhythmic texts, she also had extremely conservative views about poetry, thinking that contemporary European poetry brings poetry, is the decadence of poetry. It makes poetry fall apart and suffer decline.
Она не знала и не думала о феминизме, но своей фигурой, своим способом социализации в литературе, мне кажется, она заложила определенный фон такой как бы творческой свободы, который оказался важен для многих поэтесс и поэтов.
So while she did not identify as a feminist, her social behavior created a kind of example, created a kind of environment that proved an important example for poetesses of my generation.
We have a question that has already been asked in the chat, and maybe some of you would like to respond to this. The question is, почему вы используете слово поэтка? Этому есть какая-то причина? Поэтесса нельзя? So why are we using in Russian the word poetka? It's a neologism to mean a female poet, in place of the more traditional feminine marked word for poet, which is poetess, poetessa.
Галя проводила опрос год назад или полтора уже года назад, спрашивала у русскоязычных поэтесс, поэток и поэтов, да, какие номинации они предпочитают, и нужно сказать, что картина просто вот была очень разнообразная, потому что ответы были кардинально разными, да. Вообще поэтесса в русской поэзии слово, если смотреть там на классическую поэзию, там на Ахматову, например, да, то эта номинация, она считается уничижительной, обесценивающей в какой-то степени, да, то есть поэт, а есть поэтесса, но мне кажется, что в поэзии последнего времени, и для этого очень многое сделали именно фем-поэтессы, вот эта номинация поэтесса, она перестала вообще каким-либо образом коннотироваться, то есть здесь нет ничего плохого, уничижительного, оскорбительного, да. Хотя и существует еще и параллельно поэтка, кураторка, поэтка и так далее, то есть вот эти вот феминитивы совсем недавно появившиеся, но опять-таки вот даже среди фем-поэтесс нет никакого консенсуса по поводу того, как себя называть, кто как хочет, так и называет. Поэтесса, поэтка, поэт.
So Yulia starts off by saying that perhaps this is something that Galia can talk more about, because a year to a year and a half ago, Galia did a survey of various of Russian-speaking poets and poetesses about which forms they prefer to use. And the results of the survey were extremely varied, and there was no consensus. Traditionally, the word poetessa poetess, traditionally, it's a traditional word, which classical Russian women poets like Akhmatova famously did not like to employ, and objected to being described this way. But it is no longer the case, because some feminist women poets prefer to call themselves poetessa. So in fact, we are right now in a situation where there really is no consensus, and we try to call people what they prefer to be called.
Yeah, I'll just add the only thing, in case people watching don't know about this, the reason Akhmatova did not agree to use the word poetess was because it had, at least in her view and the view of many people, negative, insulting connotations, implying that poetess is always secondary to poet and worse than poet.
Well, it's a magic word for me, form, so I heard it and I'm always happy to address it, particularly in the case of Galina's poem that I translated, The Gates of the Body. Every poem offers an experience of moving through a certain space. And in this poem, we move through a Soviet urban landscape, but also through the landscape of a body, and it consists of 14 parts, yet they're kind of all together, yet they could serve as separate poems. They're all of different lengths, and it's very much like a body, which consists of parts of different lengths, size, and function, which somehow takes me directly to Lolita's poem that she read, right? Because she also took us through the body in her poem. And here too, this kind of separate parts, they indicate that we are moving through spaces that offer this different function. But also every good poem has a rhythm of its own. Galia said something about this wonderful poet Helena Schwartz and her worry that European poetry is disintegrating. I think that on just on the first look at a free verse poem, one might find it so casual and so natural speaking, and one might mistake it for prose, for the language of prose written with lines. But a translator, myself for instance, when I start translating into English in this case, and this is something that Kit has touched upon, of course, there's nothing free about this free verse, and this language that appears so casual and so relaxed, and so kind of like girlfriends chatting as they're walking on the street. It's actually very tight. The language is very tight, and it's full of tensions. And as you read Galia's poem, Summer Gates of the Body, you could notice those tensions. I noticed them because I had to understand those knots and those muscles in order to have a foundation for the language that I had to find. And in her case, it's these kind of large abandoned spaces versus cramped small spaces of living, right? Which goes to that idea of living in a very large country, these large industrial sites and factories, abandoned and empty, yet people are kind of crammed inside it in these small residential spaces where they have no private space, and even washing, something as intimate as washing, happens next to grandmother. So you're cramped together. And then there is this tension between fertility of the body, because there's also a pregnant cow in this poem, and the mother delivers a child, and there's a grandmother who obviously had the mother of the poet speak in the poem. So, and fertility is health, right? Yet there's so much sickness and that is associated with the body in this poem, together with this great health and fertility. And then there is this overflowing sense of love that this poem has, that works in opposition to also a sense of absence of love. And the two are also in conflict, great lack of it, and at the same time overflowing with it. And that just in the excerpt that we read for you, there was the tension between human body and animal body. Then there is that sense in that poem also of a great sensuality and a great ability to understand and feel every little thing around. Yet what the world offers to this person who is so great at sensuality is some kind of bluntness and absence of sensuality. And so that is also in conflict there. Or this kind of little things like the poem opens with lying next to the sun. No, that's actually in the excerpt we read. There's washing next to the grandmother and lying next to the sun. And in the moment when the child washes with her grandmother, and that's something I used to do actually as a girl. My grandma and I used to wash together, and I was also fascinated by her body. But there is a sense of disconnect there. And then there is that great sense of connection when the poet lies next to her son and is in control of the time, right, through as she runs her hand through his hair. So I just wanted to say that about in defense of poetry that might look like it's disintegrating, it might look so, it might give the illusion of being so casual and prosaic, while in fact it's all so tight and it's held through these oppositions and tensions.
A question now from Galia to her fellow authors in the anthology.
Да, я хотела спросить авторов, которые здесь присутствуют, в какой связи для вас находится поэзия и насилие? Насилие как в самом широком смысле, так и насилие государственное, дискурсивное, насилие сексуальное и гендерное. Является ли поэзия для вас способом противостоять насилию? И насколько сильно в своей поэзии вы рефлексируете над теми формами насилия, которые пронизывают сегодня вашу частную жизнь и российскую действительность, насколько это важно для вас?
The question for the poets is about poetry and violence and the extent to which violence is something you think about in your work and the extent to which and how you bring the two together.
Мне кажется, вот этот вопрос от Галины, он очень закономерный, потому что фемпоэзия, конечно же, это такой инструмент, может быть, деконструкции каких-то дискурсов, связанных с насилием, и, может быть, зачастую, даже не может быть, а зачастую является способом проговаривания травмы. Но опять-таки говорить о том, что вот травмоговорение в поэзии, в фемпоэзии, да, оно повсюду, повсеместно не приходится. И мне кажется, нужно предоставить слово Екатерине Симоновой, которая пытается... У нее свои особые отношения с насилием, то есть здесь нет такого классического проговаривания травмы, то есть я-говорение, но тем не менее разные формы травматических дискурсов, они присутствуют в ее поэзии, и деконструируются, в том числе с помощью иронии.
Yulia said that it makes sense for Galia to ask this question. It's a key issue, but it's an issue that's connected to trauma and traumatic language. And so I think that maybe Ekaterina Simonova should talk about it, because different traumatic discourses play a large role in her work.
Even as she deconstructs them using irony.
Я начну со своей любимой фразы, которую я люблю повторять очень часто, и принадлежит она не мне. Мой поэтический учитель, нижнетагильский поэт Евгений Туренко однажды сказал фразу, которая мне на тот момент показалась очень странной, когда я ее впервые услышала. Поэзия нужна слабым людям. Прошло много лет, прежде чем я эту фразу поняла, и действительно, поэзия оказалась нужна в первую очередь слабым людям, как показывает жизнь. Но исходя из этого, на самом деле поэзия, как и любой вид искусства, это само по себе насилие. Но именно, может быть, потому что это какое-то определенное насилие, она от насилия, сама поэзия нас и спасает. Это как, может быть, это тот минус, который на минус дает, в свою очередь, плюс. Что к этому добавить, я, честно говоря, не знаю.
Katya, Ekaterina Simonova offers a quote from someone who she calls a teacher, so we're getting an indirect answer to our question about genealogies. A poet from Nizhny Tagil, Evgeny Turenko, who said at one point a phrase that she remembered for all time, that poetry is, the people who need poetry are the weak people. Poetry is necessary for weak people. And that this is a sort of a paradoxical thing to say, but something that she bears in mind in her own work. She also brings up the idea that poetry is itself a kind of violence, like in the same way that other art forms can be a kind of violence, but that this, in the case of poetry, and in this poetry in particular, the minus, the negativity associated with violence can actually turn into a kind of plus.
Мне просто кажется, что поэзия во многом это по-своему такой деколониальный мир, где действительно не существует тех границ, ограничений и тех форм насилия, которые существуют вокруг, ну, то есть в идеальном варианте. И мне нравится, что поэзия дает возможность выхода за эти рамки, она дает возможность говорить о том, о чем не принято, или о том, за что условно прилетит по голове. И в этом смысле мне кажется, что связь между насилием и поэзией на самом деле при всей внешней, казалось бы, несоотносимости очень даже очевидна и, быть может, даже закономерна. Просто поскольку поэзия как safe place, где все ощущают себя вправе и достаточно свободными, чтобы говорить то, что они могут говорить, она дает тебе возможность в том числе говорить и о самом страшном, и о насилии, и о том опыте, который испытываешь не только ты, но и человек рядом с тобой.
One of the things that Egana began with was saying that poetry is a space, among other things, a space of freedom, a decolonized space in which the various forms of violence that obtain in the world are not present. In this sense, it is poetry is existing outside of the framework of everyday life, political life, and so on. It's a space where you can say whatever you want to say, a space of freedom in this sense. But at the same time, the ties between poetry and violence she sees as very, very close. And that it is a kind of a logical union, because even though it is a safe place and a free space, at the same time, it's a space where you are able to talk about all of the terrible things, all of the violent things that are going on, both with you, with other people who are around you.
Мне кажется, что в целом вопрос, поставленный Галей, и именно поэтому, я думаю, он встречает в первую очередь молчание, представляет собой все-таки слишком предоставляет слишком большое поле для спекуляций. Вот. В том смысле, что мы продолжаем ходить в разговоре о феминистской поэзии, как мне кажется, довольно сложный вопрос о том, что феминистская поэзия также является еще и поэзией, потому что это ставит нас в некоторое неудобное место, поскольку феминизм представляет собой дискурс горизонтальный. Вот. Но, тем не менее, мы стремимся к некоторой полной кооптации как бы первой дефиниции, то есть феминизм, точнее поэзии в феминизм. Вот. И поэтому понятно, что с одной стороны это действительно довольно важный вопрос про связь поэтики и политики, как это все может преломляться друг в друге. Но мне кажется, что в целом довольно важным остается другой вопрос, который мы, ввиду того, что мы не понимаем, что с этим делать, затушевываем под вопросами о политике. То есть каким образом, какова связь феминизма и искусства? То есть как это комбинируется, что находится, что становится важнее, какие мы можем изобретать новые критерии. Вот. И в этом смысле, конечно, вопросы о политике всегда для меня на протяжении всех этих лет оказываются довольно смущающими, поскольку в целом на них у нас у всех есть более-менее заготовленные ответы.
Да, Лолита, но этих ответов не знают зрители сегодняшнего мероприятия.
Да, Галя, дорогая, я понимаю.
So Lolita brings up some reservations she has about this question about poetry and violence, and they are connected to some bigger reservations she has about the question of the idea of feminist poetry, this bringing together of a concept like feminism, which she points out as a discourse, is a horizontal discourse, and then the question of poetry, or even more broadly of art, and that when you bring together something like poetics and politics, feminism and art, it becomes difficult to talk about them both at the same time, right? And she brings up, this was what Galia and she were going back and forth about there at the end. She brings up that if you're asking questions specifically about politics, there are maybe not so many variations on the kind of answer that you would get from the poets in this anthology, from everybody here who is present, which is a great thing, I think, for us to think about.
But is the presupposition that feminist discourse is horizontal, but artistic discourse is vertical, hierarchical? То есть пресуппозиция — это то, что поэтический дискурс иерархичен, или я...
Ну да, вы абсолютно правы. Вы абсолютно правы. Это старый вопрос.
How, what did the translators do to convey the variety of voices and the shock value of this poetry, which it definitely has in Russian, to the English language audience, and to what extent were the poets themselves involved in the translation process? Thank you.
One of the reasons why we decided to have a range of translators is precisely so that we could have a range of voices. And so that a translator, so that you could kind of have a translator think about one or two poets and not everybody.
I'd like to say something to answer Maria's question, and also I think maybe to make an arc to Svetlana Alexievich and the unwomanly face of war that Eugene quoted when he talked about Olga Shparaga in the beginning. I think that phrase, the unwomanly face of war, and that I think also translates to the unwomanly voice of many things: war, poetry, violence, and I think that I always took that phrase as not as something that is told as honestly and directly, but as a challenge and a confrontation. Sort of, you think that it's unwomanly, don't you? But it's not. In fact, the voice of war, the voice of violence is women's voice. It is very much women's voice and women's face. And it was true for Olesya Domovich, who was the mentor of Svetlana Alexievich, and who was the first to introduce that polyphonic writing, right? And it started for him with recording a woman speak at a memorial opening, and then looking at her face and listening to her story. Later on, he decided that he would not write any fiction anymore, that he would only be writing in voices. And then for Alexievich, when she was working on this book, The Unwomanly Face of War, she was interviewing women, and what she discovered was that women were doing what poets do, which is what, instead of repeating the official narrative, the agreed upon language, the language that everybody had and everybody repeated, they felt that they had no right to use that language because it was men's language. So they had to have that kind of creative effort and invent a completely new language in order to speak about the experience of war. And as they invented this language and spoke to her in this new language, that's when the first time, I feel, in the Russian language literature, we actually read about how a human being experiences war. So it was retold by women, right? It was a language created by women who didn't want to use the male language, but it was the closest that we got to the experience of a human being in war, the experience of great violence. And it's a very poetic effort, right? So it's the poet also invents a language for something that is not there yet. And here, I mean, you say vagina, you say my grandmother's breasts, and you're already talking about violence. It is impossible to talk about a female body and not to talk about violence. But then the language with which they write, the poems we just heard today, is a completely new poetic language, I think. Do you agree? I'm not an expert in Russian poetry, but I hear it as a new language, and all of these poets write in it, and a lot of it is about female body, and yet also it's the closest I get to what it means to have an experience, a human experience of somebody living in the Russian Federation. Because I do feel that I am taking a shower, like in Galina's poem with a grandmother. I do feel that I am washing with these poets in the water of this poetry, of this language. I'm standing there naked next to them and hope that kind of they return my gaze as I look at them.
I think that we often expect a certain shock from Russian poets. You know, there's an idea of Russian poets that they shock, that they grandstand, that they terrify and amaze, and that's of course a real tradition in Russian poetry. But I found when I came to translate Ekaterina's work, I was trying to put shock, and I was also trying to put reverence into it, where shock and reverence were not the primary tonal qualities.
Just on the question of shock, and in particular, you know, there are a lot of different poems in this collection. And I'll just speak to my vagina. I don't associate that word with this poem. I was really struck by this poem for its power and its truth-telling, and not because it was in some way breaking any boundaries for me or shocking me in any particular way. I thought that it was an extraordinarily potent statement of a certain kind of political subjectivity as it relates to bodiliness. And it bowled me over, and I thought that it was an incredibly important text. But I didn't associate it with the word shock. And I will say that the aftermath of that poem's publication, in which it seems to shock certain kinds of, I guess, kind of old and grisly members of the Russian political establishment, came as a surprise to me, that certain people objected to the poem for the terms that it uses, for, I don't know, for being a poem about a vagina, which seemed to me like the craziest thing ever. It did shock some people. It doesn't strike me as a shocking poem. I think it's a powerful poem. I don't pretend to be an expert in feminist poetry in the United States, or certainly not everywhere else. And I know that there is feminist, mobilization, which uses literature in the United States and in other places. But I have the sense that there is something very special going on in Russia in terms of mobilization of feminist voices in poetry. Something special and unique, that feminist poetry has a very prominent place right now in the cultural landscape. And I wanted to know what the poets have to say about why that is. Why now feminist poetry is such a seemingly important and significant movement in Russia. And also why poetry, mobilizing people to do anything with poetry, is a crazy idea. So why in particular poetry as a mobilizational tool for feminism in Russia?
У меня этому есть некоторое объяснение со стороны, точнее, два объяснения. Первое, точнее, три объяснения. Первое, значит, почему происходит вообще мобилизация культурного феминизма в России? Мне кажется, это прямое следствие политической ситуации в стране, когда прямое политическое действие для многих оказывается невозможным и просто опасным для свободы, для жизни, то наше политическое воображение ищет иные формы противодействия сложившемуся, да, в том числе авторитарному порядку, и иные способы воображения, которое касается построения иных политических сообществ и иных форм коммуникации, которая в том числе связана с ненасилием и равноправием.
At the beginning of an answer to Kevin's question, a few kind of indirect explanations for why feminism, why today, why this mobilization of feminist discourse in poetic form. As an initial explanation, Galina says that it is increasingly difficult to engage in direct political action in Russia today. So poetry is one of a number of alternative forms of resistance that are developing, and that it goes along with the formation of alternative political communities and alternative forms of communication in this environment.
И политическая критика и политическое действие начинают приобретать разные трактовки, да, связанные не только с прямым уличным протестом, и мигрируют в разные сферы жизни, в том числе в культуру, в искусство, в частную жизнь и в поэтические практики. И почему именно феминистская поэзия становится как бы впереди, да, по своей, может быть, повестке сегодня? Именно потому, что четко улавливает вот эту вот связь насилия системного и того, как системное насилие затрагивает наши частные жизни, тела и сексуальность. и появление новых законов в России, напрямую связанных с вмешательством в частную жизнь, в телесность, в сексуальность, как бы вообще право на частные свободы и право на безопасность для женщин, да, они так или иначе говорят о том, насколько как бы российский режим глубоко да, внедряется в самые разные сферы, вот, не только внешнеполитический контроль.
So this in this environment where direct political protest is increasingly difficult or impossible, these forms of culture, of art, of private life are becoming a more significant space for political expression, including the way you write poetry, right? The practice of poetry. Why is feminism at the vanguard of this movement? Precisely because of the way that it expresses and engages with the violence of this system, of this political system, the way that, and this relates very much to what Eugene was talking about at the very beginning of our program, the idea that when you have a political regime that is directly invading the private spaces of people's bodies, of their sexuality, of private life in general, and that this is experienced first and foremost by women, in particular in Russian society today. I think that's basically the gist of what Galina was saying.
И когда один из главных феминистских лозунгов «Мое тело, мое дело» затрагивает не только жизни женщин и как бы вещи, связанные с гендерным насилием и репродуктивной, скажем, политикой, а когда мое тело, мое дело становится невозможным буквально для каждого гражданина страны, оказывается, что именно феминистский дискурс, и в том числе в литературе, как наиболее озабоченный этой проблематикой, способен дать ответы на многие большие политические вопросы.
Galina brings up the idea of this kind of state violence in the context of reproductive politics, these abortion-related conversations we've been having. So my body is my business. Galina points out that in the space of feminist poetry written by women, it is actually the discourse that is the most well-equipped to address these political issues.
К вопросу о том, почему феминистская и почему сегодня. Мне кажется, довольно важно упомянуть, что все-таки феминистское движение, что бы мы под ним не подразумевали, в России имело некоторый накопительный как бы эффект. Та почва, на которой сегодня функционирует так называемый культурный феминизм, которым мы занимаемся, она подготовлена и подготавливалась, если говорить о феминизме в том, приблизительно хотя бы в том виде, в котором мы его знаем сегодня в России, подготавливалась большим количеством активисток в нулевых, в начале десятых годов, когда феминизма еще не было ни в каком медийном пространстве. Эти феминистки в целом по-прежнему существуют, и это оказывалось и оказывается довольно тяжелым, безвестным трудом, лишенным медийной поддержки, на котором мы уже можем воздвигать некоторый свой культурный феминизм, которым мы занимаемся.
Lolita is pointing out that what we might call today's cultural feminism in Russia right now, which, as we have been discussing, has become more and more visible and is a growing movement today, really is the result of a lot of unsung and invisible labor done by women and feminists in the past, particularly the past 2 decades, but also earlier, and that these women and the movement that they represented that has really gotten Russian feminism to where it is today was really given no media coverage whatsoever in its time, but nevertheless these women are still working now and obviously laid the ground for what there is now.
Вот Лолита действительно сказала очень важную вещь о том, что культурный феминизм подготавливает, в принципе, повседневный тяжелый активизм, который не связан с культурой и с литературой, а связан там с созданием НКО, которые помогают женщинам, оказавшимся в ситуации насилия, те, кто создают шелтеры, те, кто создают ресурсные центры для женщин. Но мне кажется, важно отметить еще и такой момент, что в антологии есть авторки, которые занимаются в том числе и этой работой, да, активисткой, которая не сводится только к литературе и культуре, также связана с повседневной организацией разных пространств для существования феминизма. И это Даша Сиренко, которая сегодня здесь не выступает, но, я надеюсь, будет на других презентациях. Но и важно еще также то, что литература, как мне кажется, и, в принципе, культура это очень важное поле борьбы для феминизма, мне кажется, для феминистского движения, потому что именно в литературе мы можем пересоздавать символический порядок, потому что власть и насилие, они закреплены не только на телесном, да, уровне, на уровне конкретных законов, но и также на уровне символического порядка, который тесно как бы передается из поколения в поколение в разных обществах и сообществах. И разрушить этот символический порядок, прежде всего в каждом отдельном сознании, как раз культура и искусство могут помочь.
Indeed, we should remember that even among the authors of this anthology are women who work for women's shelters, for NGOs, who are engaged in the kind of less visible social activism that is so important for the feminist movement, and who are working in that way in a very concrete and physical sense, and not strictly literary or cultural. But at the same time, she does say that she thinks the work that is being done in poetry is extremely important for changing the real social order, and that in the way that poetry works with something that she calls the symbolic order, and has the capacity to destroy a symbolic order that is basically holding up the social and political system that inheres in Russia today. In this sense, the work of cultural actors and the poets of the anthology is in its own way also participating in a very concrete and direct way.
I want to close with putting this event in the broad context of not just Russian feminist poetry or Russian poetry, but the current world order. Poetry is constantly destroying and giving birth to a new language, and the change in language is the change in mind. So our intention as Globus Books, as myself, is that our reading and this talk today will shift the existing mentality, even if just a bit, and eventually the reality by its content, by its form, and just by the fact of its happening today and now. Because we here do something critical. We give representation for these voices. We make these poetic voices heard and further explore the silence that is imposed on women historically in Russia, in the US, and everywhere around the world. Now we enter the unknown of tomorrow with this new language, this new thinking, and I want to believe with hope. Thank you everyone who were listening to us, who were reading, all the poetkas, all the переводчицы, all the translators, our audience on YouTube, our audience on Zoom, and everybody who joined us. Let's do it. Let's enter tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fantastic event. И огромное спасибо поэтам. Слышать ваши голоса — это просто подарок.
Всем спасибо большое.